Daniel Wexford had not told anyone he was coming home 3 days early. The Geneva meetings had ended faster than expected. He was halfway across the marble hallway when he heard his mother's voice through the half-open living room door. He stopped. "You should leave tonight, before he gets back." The voice was low and even, the voice Celeste used when she wanted something to sound like kindness. "Take the money and leave. The child may be a Wexford. You never will be." Daniel's suitcase slipped slightly in his hand. For a moment he told himself he had misunderstood. There was some explanation. There had to be. Then Sarah answered, and there was no explanation left to hope for. "I'm not leaving my husband." Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent his months fighting a battle. She was never supposed to fight alone. 7 months pregnant, one hand resting low on her belly. Her face was pale, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that Daniel had not noticed before. On the coffee table sat a document, several pages, a pen laid across the top with deliberate care. Not in anger, in preparation. Celeste stood on the other side of the table in cream silk, pearls resting against her throat, her hair pinned so perfectly that not one strand dared move. Her posture was so composed it looked rehearsed. It was rehearsed. Celeste had never believed Sarah belonged in the Wexford family. To her, Sarah was temporary, an outsider who had somehow convinced Daniel to choose love over legacy. The pregnancy had only made the problem more urgent. Every day Sarah remained in this house was another day Daniel drifted further beyond her control. The offer was simple. Sign the document, take the money, and walk away. Refuse, and Celeste would spend every day making sure Sarah regretted staying. One way or another, she intended to force her out before Daniel returned. Daniel's grip tightened on the suitcase handle. The golden evening light poured through the tall windows, but the room suddenly felt suffocating. And for the first time, Daniel understood. His home had not been protecting his wife. It had been breaking her. He stepped forward. His shoe caught the threshold. Both women turned. Celeste recovered instantly. The coldness vanished from her face and was replaced by the familiar warmth she always wore around Daniel. "You're early." He didn't smile back. His attention moved from the document to Sarah's face, and what he saw there told him everything he needed to know before anyone explained a single word. The exhaustion, the fear, the way she stood, like someone who had been carrying this fight alone for months. Daniel pointed at the document on the table. "What's that?" he asked quietly. "A private arrangement, between Sarah and myself. It doesn't concern you." "It concerns me." His voice came out flat and colder than he expected. "I heard what you said to her. Don't try to soften it now." For the first time, something flickered behind his mother's composure. Not guilt, calculation. The look of someone recalculating an argument she thought she had already won. He picked up the document. Every page made the truth clearer. This wasn't a mother's anger. It was a carefully prepared plan to remove his wife before he came home. Daniel set the document down and looked at his mother, waiting for a denial that never came. The silence was the only answer either of them needed. Sarah hadn't moved. She stood with one hand still on her belly, watching him. She wasn't waiting to be rescued, Daniel realized. She was waiting to see what he would do now that he knew the truth. "Sarah isn't leaving this house. You are." Celeste blinked. "This is my house, Daniel. As long as Edward's name is on the property, I have every right to be here. That right ended the moment you tried to force my wife from this house while I was away." He looked directly at her. For a long moment, Celeste didn't move. Daniel watched something pass across her face that he had never seen there before. Not anger. Fear. Quick and small and gone almost as soon as it arrived. The fear of a woman realizing the ground underneath her had just changed shape. Then she straightened, and the fear disappeared behind something harder. "You understand what you're choosing," I built this family, brick by brick. I built the name you carry, and you're throwing it all away for a woman who has nothing to offer this house but a child she can't even guarantee is yours. Don't. Celeste looked him straight in the eye. Her expression turned cold. I will strip you of everything, Daniel. Her voice trembled with anger. Every account, every asset, every cent tied to this family will be gone until you decide to let her go. Then I'll lose it. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I don't care what you take. I care about what you tried to do tonight. And I am not going to spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't see it. Celeste looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the version of her son that always backed down. She didn't find him. You'll regret this, she said quietly. She left without another word. Her heels were sharp against the marble floor. The front door closed behind her with a finality that felt louder than any shout would have. Daniel and Sarah stood in the silence Celeste left behind. Neither of them moved. The document still sat on the table between them like something that needed to be buried. Then Sarah sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa. Her hands were shaking. Daniel sat beside her and looked at her. How long had this been going on? Sarah didn't answer right away. Outside, the evening light was fading. The house felt different already. Lighter, somehow. Since the week you told her I was pregnant. Daniel closed his eyes. At first it was little things. Remarks about her background. Suggestions that she wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in the Wexford family. Then it got worse whenever Daniel travelled. 6 weeks earlier, Sarah had tried to warn him. Daniel was preparing for another overseas trip when Sarah stopped him. His attention was divided between work emails, last-minute presentations, and the car waiting outside. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes red and her hands trembling. Your mother called my doctor, Sarah said. She tried to arrange a private consultation about my pregnancy. She wanted medical information. The clinic called me to confirm. The phone in his pocket buzzed. His driver was waiting. His flight schedule was already slipping. And like many mistakes that later become impossible to forget, the moment seemed small when it happened. I'll talk to her, Daniel said. He kissed Sarah's forehead, picked up his suitcase, and left. The conversation stayed behind. So did the damage. Long after the car disappeared down the driveway, Sarah remained in the doorway with one hand resting on her stomach. For the first time, she wondered if anyone in this house truly saw what was happening to her. Then Celeste made her position impossible to misunderstand. The felt birds were the first thing Sarah noticed when she walked into the nursery one morning. 3 of them lying on the carpet near the window, one with a broken wing. She had stitched that wing 3 times to get the tension right. Daniel had kissed the top of her head while she worked. We can just buy a mobile, he'd said. I want her to have something I made. Now it was on the floor. She knelt and picked up the smallest one, the grey bird, its wing torn loose. Not by accident. The way you take down something that doesn't belong to you and doesn't matter. She heard the heels behind her. Celeste's voice came from the doorway. The replacements arrive Thursday. Pieces more appropriate for a Wexford nursery. The rocking chair alone cost more than anyone in your family has ever earned in a year. Sarah looked up at her, still on her knees, the felt bird closed in her fist. Celeste stood in the doorway in cream silk, composed, as though she hadn't just dismantled the only room in this house that had ever felt like Sarah's own. You don't get to decide what this child needs. You're not a Wexford. You just happen to be carrying one. Celeste's eyes moved over her, slow and deliberate, the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away. Enjoy it while it lasts. You'll be back where you belong soon. Sarah understood then. It had never been Sarah's nursery. The furniture, the room, even the child. All of it belonged to the family. She was simply the one carrying the air. Celeste turned and walked away. The heels faded down the hall. Sarah stayed on the floor. Near the window, 2 wooden rings from the mobile lay abandoned. Her father had carved the rings by hand. Sarah had sewn each of the felt birds herself. This had been the one room she had built with her own hands. Now none of it remained. The morning after Daniel left for Geneva, Sarah stood in the doorway of the nursery. The new furniture had arrived on Thursday, exactly as Celeste had promised. It was beautiful. The crib was imported from Italy, hand-carved, worth more than her father had made in a year. The rocking chair was upholstered in silk. The mobile above the crib was crystal, tiny prisms catching the light. It looked like a room from a magazine. A room designed by someone who had never sat on the floor stitching, felt birds by hand. A room where a Wexford baby would sleep. Sarah stood in the doorway for nearly 10 minutes. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply looked at the room that had been taken from her and understood, finally, that this house would never let her be a mother. It would only let her be a vessel, a carrier of the Wexford name. A woman expected to give the family an heir while having less say in the life she was creating. She closed the door and never opened it again. Daniel opened his eyes. The memories were still settling, rearranging themselves into a pattern he should have seen months ago. The nursery. She told me you redecorated. She said you'd changed your mind about the furniture. Sarah looked at him. Is that what she told you? He remembered the call. He had been away on a business trip, rushing between meetings when his mother called. His mother's voice, casual, almost amused. Sarah had decided the nursery wasn't quite right. She was having everything replaced. Nesting instinct. He had laughed. He had agreed. He had hung up and thought nothing of it. She waited until your car left the driveway. Sarah said. The movers came that afternoon. They took everything. The crib, the dresser, even the mobile my father helped me make. The memory hit Daniel harder than he expected. He remembered the warning she'd tried to give him weeks earlier. He remembered dismissing it. And for the first time, he understood exactly how alone she'd been. The apology came quietly. Sarah accepted it just as quietly. There was nothing left to argue about, only the damage they both wished had been seen sooner. Daniel reached for Sarah's hand. For too long he had failed to see what was happening inside his own home. That would not happen again. Whatever came next, he would protect his family. What he didn't know was his mother had already decided to make them pay for choosing each other. Celeste did not go quietly into defeat. She simply changed weapons. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself replaying the moment over and over. He should have known his mother better than that. It reached him at work first. 3 days after the confrontation, Daniel arrived at the office to find 2 members of the company's compliance department waiting outside his office. They asked him to step into a conference room. An anonymous complaint had been filed. Questions had been raised about several financial approvals carrying Daniel's signature. Nothing criminal, nothing proven, but enough to trigger a formal review. For the next 2 hours, Daniel sat across from investigators answering questions about transactions he barely remembered approving months earlier. When the meeting ended, he walked back through the office feeling every pair of eyes on him. People looked away when he passed. Others didn't. By the end of the week, the board had requested a temporary review of several projects under his supervision. No accusations, no charges, just suspicion. Daniel knew exactly where it had come from. Then it reached him everywhere else. A card declined at a restaurant he'd eaten at for years, the maitre d' apologetic. Daniel fumbling for a second card while pretending not to notice the looks from the next table. He told himself it was a banking error. Then a second card was declined at a pharmacy, of all places, buying prenatal vitamins. The pharmacist was discreet, but Daniel felt the shame burn across his skin regardless. Within days, the pressure was impossible to ignore. A transfer Daniel had authorized from a family account simply didn't arrive. The account was a legacy one, opened in both their names back when Daniel was still in college, the kind neither of them had bothered to restructure once he took over running his own affairs. When he called the bank, the representative was polite, but firm. The funds were unavailable. No further information could be provided. The manager was equally polite, equally firm, equally unwilling to explain what had happened. Daniel hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment, the truth finally beginning to take shape. A medical bill for Sarah's prenatal care was returned unpaid. The clinic called directly, and Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen, unsure what had happened. 3 days later, Sarah arrived at the clinic. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when she checked in. There had been a change to the family account on file. The Wexford family would no longer be responsible for expenses related to her care. For a moment, Sarah simply stood there, exhausted, standing in a crowded waiting room while strangers tried not to listen. The request had come from Celeste Wexford's office. And somehow, Daniel's mother still wasn't finished. The letters began arriving a few days later. Polite letters. Embarrassed letters. A vendor who had serviced the Wexford family for 3 generations wrote to inform Daniel that, at Celeste's instruction, all future invoices would need to be directed to her personal office. The message was clear. Daniel Wexford was no longer considered financially reliable by his own mother, and she intended to make sure everyone in their circle knew it. He sat in his study late one evening, the letters spread across his desk like evidence, late notices, declined transactions. A polite message from the head of a private school where Daniel had pledged a substantial donation arrived a few days later. The payment had not gone through. The humiliation cut deeper than the financial pressure itself. Celeste wasn't just trying to take the family money. She was dismantling his reputation, one embarrassment at a time. Late one evening, Sarah found him sitting alone in his study. The desk lamp cast a small circle of light across the scattered letters and notices spread before him. She lowered herself carefully into the chair opposite him. 9 months pregnant, exhausted, and carrying more worry than she ever admitted, she studied the papers without asking questions. She already knew the answer. Every day seemed to bring a new problem. Another account, another delay, another quiet reminder that someone was working behind the scenes to make their lives harder. Daniel folded one of the letters and set it aside. The money didn't frighten him. Money could be earned again. What unsettled him was something far worse, the growing realization that the woman responsible for all of it might not be the mother he thought he knew. Sarah reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. Neither of them spoke. They sat together in the silence. For all the damage Celeste had caused, Daniel still wasn't ready to give up on her. The following afternoon, he went to his mother's office. The moment he stepped into her office, he knew the meeting would change nothing. Celeste barely looked up from her desk. There was no surprise in her expression, no regret, no guilt. Only the irritation of someone interrupted while carrying out a plan she had already decided was necessary. "If you're here because of Sarah, you're wasting your time." Daniel stopped a few feet from the desk. For a moment, he searched her face for some sign that she regretted what she had done. He found none. "She's my wife." Celeste finally looked up. "And she's still the problem." The word settled heavily between them. Daniel quickly realized she had no interest in defending her actions. As far as Celeste was concerned, Sarah remained the problem. Nothing else mattered. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. By the time Daniel left, one thing had become painfully clear. His mother was not looking for compromise. She was waiting for surrender. And until Sarah was gone, she intended to continue the fight. Daniel walked out without another word. Behind him, the office door closed. For the first time in his life, it felt like a door closing on their relationship as well. What neither of them knew was that Celeste's campaign had already run into a wall she couldn't see coming. A wall built years earlier by a man who had loved his family enough to prepare for every possibility. Daniel's father, Edward Wexford, had been dead for years, yet the decisions he made before his death were about to change everything. Since his father's death, Daniel had rarely thought about the details of the estate. He had always assumed the house, the accounts, and the controlling shares sat under one roof of shared ownership, his mother's hand resting somewhere over all of it. He was wrong. A few weeks later, Daniel and Sarah attended a charity dinner hosted by one of the family's oldest associates. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and old money. Many of the guests had known the Wexford family for decades. At first, the evening passed quietly. Guests drifted from table to table. Old friends stopped to greet Daniel. Others congratulated Sarah on the baby. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then dinner was announced. Daniel and Sarah followed the guests toward the main table together. They had almost reached their seats when a member of the staff stepped into their path. The man's expression was apologetic. "There has been a change in the seating arrangements." The room seemed to grow quieter. Before either of them could respond, both place cards were removed from the table. A different table had been prepared across the room. Several guests looked away. Others pretended not to notice. No one said a word. Daniel stood frozen. The embarrassment hit him instantly. Not because of where they were being asked to sit, because everyone in the room understood exactly what was happening. Across the table, Celeste remained perfectly composed, watching, satisfied. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Neither Daniel nor Sarah belonged at the family table anymore, at least not in Celeste's eyes. Daniel looked around the room. No one intervened. No one challenged it. He could feel dozens of eyes on them. Slowly he placed a hand at Sarah's back. Together they walked toward the smaller table prepared for them. As they crossed the ballroom, conversations gradually resumed. The evening continued. The music played. The dinner was served. But neither of them forgot what had happened. And as they sat among strangers for the rest of the night, Sarah finally understood something she had spent months trying not to believe. This was no longer about Daniel. It was no longer about the baby. It wasn't even about the Wexford legacy. Celeste simply hated her. And in the process, she was willing to humiliate her own son as well. As far as Celeste was concerned, everything was going exactly as planned. The dinner had only strengthened that belief. That confidence followed her all the way to the offices of Pierce and Associates one Tuesday afternoon. She arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. Dressed in a charcoal suit tailored in Milan, she moved through the lobby with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never been kept waiting in her life. She was in excellent spirits. The financial pressure campaign was proceeding beautifully. Week after week, reports of Daniel's setbacks had reached her desk. Small humiliations in front of people whose opinions mattered. Another week, perhaps 2, and he would have no choice but to come to his senses and ask for her help. She would be generous, of course. Once Sarah was gone, the receptionist greeted her by name and escorted her directly to the conference room. Alan Pierce was already there, waiting. Alan Pierce had been the Wexford family's attorney for over 40 years. He had been at Edward's funeral. He had watched Daniel grow from a boy into a man. He was a cautious, meticulous man who polished his shoes every Tuesday night and had worn the same style of spectacles for 3 decades. He knew every secret, every triumph, and every fracture in the family's history, and he had never once spoken out of turn. Celeste trusted him implicitly, the way a monarch trusts a loyal chamberlain. He understood the family. He understood her. Today, however, he looked uncomfortable. "Celeste, thank you for coming." She took a seat without waiting to be asked, crossing her legs and setting her handbag on the table with a decisive click. The conference room was quiet, the mahogany table polished to a dark gleam, the walls lined with leather-bound volumes that had probably never been read. It was a room designed to intimidate, but Celeste had never been intimidated by anything that could be purchased. "Alan, I don't have all afternoon. I assume the final blocks on the discretionary accounts are ready for my signature. I want the remaining joint accounts frozen by the end of the week. Daniel needs to understand that this is not a negotiation." Alan didn't answer right away. Instead, he removed his glasses and began polishing them with a cloth from his drawer. It was a slow, deliberate ritual, one Celeste had seen him perform 100 times. Today, however, it irritated her. Alan. There's been a complication, Celeste. What kind of complication? A legal one. He replaced his glasses and met her eyes, and something in his expression made her stomach tighten. One that predates your current financial adjustments. From a leather portfolio on the desk, Alan withdrew a heavy, bound document. The cover bore the seal of the Wexford Family Trust, and it landed on the mahogany with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its size. Celeste looked at it with mild curiosity, then with growing confusion. She did not recognize the seal. She did not recognize the date. What is this? That is an irrevocable trust, established by Edward years ago. It was structured through a separate holding entity, kept apart from the accounts you managed day to day, the way estate attorneys often advise for tax and succession reasons. It was amended 6 months before he passed. The name hit her like a physical blow. Edward, her husband, dead for over a decade. That's absurd. I would have known about any trust. Edward wanted Daniel's future protected. The trust was established to ensure that when the time came, Daniel would have full control of his inheritance. Celeste opened the document. Her eyes moved across the pages, scanning the dense legal language, her composure still intact. Then she reached the final page, and as she read, something began to drain from her face. Not color, certainty, the house, the primary estate accounts, the controlling shares of Wexford Holdings. All of it had been transferred irrevocably into a trust whose sole beneficiary was Daniel Wexford. Daniel controlled the house. Daniel controlled the accounts. Daniel controlled the shares. And Celeste Wexford, who had spent decades believing she held the keys to the kingdom, controlled nothing. That's not possible. It is. And there's something else, Celeste. Alan reached into the portfolio and withdrew a separate sheet of paper. A letter, handwritten, on Edward's personal stationery. He asked that this be shared with you, if it ever came to this. Alan unfolded the letter and began to read. My wife is the strongest person I have ever known. I never doubted her for a single day of our marriage. But I have seen enough in this world to know that even the people we love most can be tested by circumstances beyond their control. I wanted Daniel to be untouchable by any of it. Alan set the letter down gently. The silence in the room was absolute. The trust was irrevocable. Daniel owned the house. Daniel controlled the accounts. There was nothing left for Celeste to freeze or leverage. The trust had never been about distrust. Edward had simply wanted to ensure that Daniel would be protected, no matter what the future brought. Celeste stood up slowly. She looked at the document. She looked at the letter. She looked at the portrait of Edward Wexford on the wall, smiling, the way he always had. How long have you known? Since the trust was established. And you never told me. Edward put the trust in place himself. My responsibility was to ensure his instructions were carried out exactly as he intended. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. The full weight of what had just happened was still settling, rearranging the furniture of her reality. She had come to this office certain that Daniel would eventually give in. Now she understood the decision had already been made. The fight had already been decided, years before it began. She picked up her handbag and walked out of the conference room without another word. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the hallway, the same rhythm she had used for decades to announce her presence in every room she entered. But this time, the sound was smaller, quieter. The sound of a woman walking away from power she had believed was hers all along. She drove home. She sat down on the sofa. Celeste thought about everything she had spent her life trying to protect. The Wexford name, the legacy Edward had built, the family she had always claimed came before everything else. Somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that protecting the family meant controlling it. Now she saw the damage that belief had done. She had turned against her own son. She had treated his wife like an enemy. She had used the family's influence and reputation as weapons against the very people she should have been protecting. For the first time, she allowed herself to see it clearly. The shame settled heavily over her. Not because she had lost, because she had nearly destroyed the one thing she had spent her entire life trying to preserve. The silence was so complete she could hear her own breathing. She did not cry. She had never been a woman who cried, but something inside her cracked. Not cleanly, not dramatically. Just a small, quiet fracture that made it impossible to hide from the truth any longer. She sat on the sofa for hours, and for the first time in years, Celeste Wexford had no plan, no strategy, and no power. Only the slow, dawning understanding that she had betrayed the very family she had sworn to protect. Celeste did not call Daniel that day, or the next, or many days after that. Daniel noticed the silence before he understood it. The calls from worried vendors stopped. The bank delays resolved themselves within days. A letter arrived from the family's financial office confirming that all accounts were operating normally. His access had been fully restored. No explanation, no apology, just the sudden, almost eerie return of everything that had been taken from him. He didn't learn the full truth until a week later, when a quiet message from Alan Pierce arrived at his office. The message was brief. The trust was secure. Edward had seen to it, and Celeste had been informed that her campaign was over. Daniel read the message 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. His father had been dead for over a decade, yet somehow he had still managed to look after his son long after he was gone. A few days later, Celeste arrived at Wexford Holdings for the quarterly executive meeting. She walked into the boardroom, expecting the usual stack of reports waiting at her seat. There were none. The meeting had already begun. The directors were discussing expansion plans, projected earnings, and a series of decisions that would once have crossed her desk first. Nobody stopped when she entered. Nobody turned to ask for her opinion. Nobody looked toward her when a vote was called. For years, she had been one of the loudest voices in the room. Now the room moved forward without her. The realization settled quietly. Not because anyone had pushed her aside, because Daniel no longer needed her permission to run what already belonged to him. She reached for her phone afterward, intending to call Daniel, then stopped. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure he would answer. The weeks that followed were the first quiet ones Daniel and Sarah had ever known in that house. Not empty quiet, not the tense silence that used to fill the rooms whenever Celeste was near. A different kind that settles after a storm passes, when the air is still damp and strange but no longer dangerous. They began, slowly, to reclaim the parts of their lives that Celeste had controlled for years. The first thing Sarah did was strip the nursery. She didn't ask permission. She didn't discuss it. One morning Daniel came upstairs to find her sitting on the floor, surrounded by the crystal mobile, the silk cushions, and the expensive Italian crib Celeste had chosen. She was packing them into boxes. "What are you doing?" "Getting rid of it. All of it." Daniel didn't argue. He knelt down beside her and helped. They spent the afternoon carrying boxes to the garage. The crystal mobile, the silk rocking chair, the expensive crib. All of it went. And when the room was empty, Sarah stood in the doorway and looked at the bare walls, the clean floor, the window where the light came in without anything in its way. "It's ours now," she said quietly. For the first time in months, her eyes were dry. The weeks that followed were quieter than any they had known before. In that quiet, they began rebuilding the life that had nearly been taken from them. One evening, as they sat on the back patio, Daniel found himself thinking about his father. "He would have liked you," he said. Sarah smiled. "You think so?" "I know so." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together as the evening settled around them, the house finally feeling like home. They hosted their first dinner party 2 weeks later. It was nothing formal. A few friends, some wine, Sarah made a roast that fell apart the way roasts are supposed to, and Daniel opened a bottle of something expensive from the cellar, and nobody corrected anyone's pronunciation or laughed at anyone's dress or made anyone feel like they didn't belong. At one point in the evening, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen, alone for a moment, listening to the sound of laughter drifting in from the dining room. Real laughter, easy laughter, the kind of laughter that happens when nobody is performing. She stood there for a full minute, her hands resting on the counter, and let herself feel it. For the first time since she had walked through those doors, the house felt like home. Their daughter was born on a quiet morning in early spring. They named her Eleanor, after no one in particular, simply because it was a name they both loved the sound of. Daniel held her first. She was small and warm, and entirely unimpressed by the world she had arrived into. Her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, and something in his chest that had been tight for months finally loosened. Sarah lay propped against the pillows, her hair damp with effort, her face luminous with a kind of exhausted peace Daniel had never seen before. For a moment there was nothing in the room but the three of them. No Wexford name, no campaign, no mother. Just a family that had nearly been torn apart and had somehow held. She had her father's eyes. Daniel insisted she had her mother's stubborn streak too. The remark made Sarah laugh, a real laugh, the first he had heard in longer than he could remember. He looked down at his daughter, at her small, serious face, at the way she seemed to be studying him already, as if deciding if he was worth trusting. He thought about the contract on the coffee table, the destroyed nursery, the phone call from Geneva, all the moments he had missed while he was somewhere else, believing the lies his mother had told him about his own home. "I'm going to do better. I promise you that." He said it quietly, not to Sarah, to Eleanor. 3 days later, Daniel sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor was asleep upstairs. Sarah was resting. His phone sat on the table, and he had been staring at it for 20 minutes. Sarah came down the stairs slowly, still moving carefully from the berth. She noticed the phone on the table and the look on Daniel's face. Then she sat down across from him. It didn't take long to understand what was on his mind. He was thinking about telling his mother. The idea had been following him for days. Yet part of him believed Celeste didn't deserve to know. Not after everything she had done. The contract, the threats, the attempt to push Sarah out of their lives before their daughter was even born. But another part of him knew Celeste was still his mother. Eleanor was her granddaughter. If he chose not to tell her, that was a decision he could never take back. Sarah listened quietly. In the end, they agreed on clear boundaries. If Celeste wanted any place in their daughter's life, she would first have to accept Daniel's wife. Not tolerate her. Not ignore her. Accept her. Only then could anything else be discussed. Daniel picked up the phone. The message he sent was short. A name, a date. Nothing more. No invitation. No attempt to soften the past. Just the facts. Celeste read the message alone in her living room. The phone buzzed. She looked down. The screen showed a name. Eleanor. Below it was a birth date. Nothing more. No warmth, no invitation. Just the facts, delivered without cruelty but without welcome either. She didn't respond. She didn't know how. For a long time, she simply stared at the screen, wondering how a woman could spend a lifetime protecting a family and still end up standing outside it. The first Christmas after Eleanor was born, Celeste spent the morning alone. She had always hosted Christmas. For years, the Wexford house had been the center of the holiday, every room filled with decorations, every table crowded with food, every guest carefully selected and perfectly seated. This year, there were no caterers, no florists, no string quartet in the corner, and no sun. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in the living room. The tree she had ordered out of habit stood in the corner, decorated by someone else because she could no longer bear to do it herself. At some point in the afternoon, she picked up her phone and found Daniel's contact. Her thumb hovered over the call button. In the end, she set the phone down, not because she didn't want to call, because she didn't know if he wanted to hear from her. That evening, she found herself thinking about Daniel as a baby. She remembered the nights she had sat beside his crib long after he had fallen asleep. She remembered his first day of school, his birthdays, the countless ordinary moments that had once seemed endless. For years, she had assumed there would always be more time. Now she wasn't so sure. The months passed. She thought about calling Daniel many times. She wanted her son back. She wanted her family back. But she didn't know how to bridge the distance she had created. For the first time in her life, Celeste Wexford was forced to accept that some things could not be fixed with money, influence, or determination alone. A month later, she finally made up her mind to put things right. On the morning she finally decided to visit, she woke earlier than she had in years. The sun was not yet up. The house was silent. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the decision she had made. She stood in her closet for nearly an hour. The rows of clothes stretched before her like an archive of the woman she had been. The cream silk she had worn the night Daniel threw her out. The black dress from Edward's funeral. The tailored suits. The pearls. The gold. In the end, she chose a simple pale blue blouse. No pearls, no silk, no armor. She had rehearsed the apology countless times. None of the words sounded right. She didn't know if Daniel would let her in. She didn't know if Sarah would even agree to see her. She only knew she couldn't stay away any longer. She drove to the house and parked at the end of the driveway. For a long time, she sat behind the wheel staring at the front door. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. She walked to the door and knocked. Nothing happened for a long moment, no footsteps, no voice, just the sound of her own pulse and the certainty, rising fast, that no one was going to answer at all. Then she heard the latch. Sarah opened the door. Neither woman spoke. Sarah held Eleanor on her hip and felt an old tension settle into her shoulders. For so long, every encounter with Celeste had required her to be ready for a battle. Celeste looked different than she remembered. Older, smaller somehow. The certainty that had always been present in her voice was gone. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Celeste said. "I know I don't deserve to be let in. I'm only asking for the opportunity to apologize." Daniel came up behind Sarah. The three adults stood in a silence that seemed to hold an entire year inside it. "I spent a lot of years believing that if I could control everything, I could keep the people I loved safe," Celeste said. Her eyes moved briefly to Sarah before returning to Daniel. "I was wrong about Sarah. I was wrong about her from the beginning. And the truth is, I wasn't just failing her. I was failing you, too." She paused. "I don't think I've ever been very good at admitting when I'm wrong. I'm not even sure I know how to apologize the way I should." Her voice faltered. "But I'm sorry, Daniel. And I'm sorry, Sarah." No one spoke. An apology didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the months of pain that had brought them here. But it was a beginning. Eleanor, restless in her mother's arms, reached one small hand toward her grandmother. Celeste stared at the tiny hand. "May I?" Daniel looked at Sarah. Something passed between them that didn't need words. After a moment, Sarah gave a small nod. Celeste stepped inside. She glanced at the chair she had occupied for years during family dinners and difficult conversations. Then she lowered herself to the floor instead. Eleanor reached for her again. This time, Sarah placed the baby gently in her arms. Daniel watched. Some things could not be repaired in a single afternoon. But for now, that didn't seem to matter. Sarah watched her daughter wrap a tiny hand around Celeste's finger. Something in her chest loosened. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Outside, the late afternoon light moved slowly across the living room floor. The same room where a document had once sat on a coffee table with a pen laid across it like a promise of disappearance. Now there was only a grandmother holding her granddaughter for the first time, and two parents standing close together, willing to let something small and uncertain begin again. One day at a time. Before you go, tell us honestly, did Celeste deserve a second chance? If you were in Daniel's position, would you have forgiven your mother after everything she did to Sarah? Type forgive or never in the comments and tell us why. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting the person you love, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable stories. We'll see you in the next one.